stumble over their speech, that it would include agitated foreigners, frightened or guilt-ridden teenagers. It would include minorities, hostile or defiant prisoners, the confused elderly, inarticulate country people. It would include intellectually handicapped, people who belong to exotic religions or fringe political groups, and of course it would include people locked in mental hospitals against their will. The list is really endless, and it just, as I said, it just licenses repression. And I think it's very, very bad. So we move on to the second criterion here, which is, in fact, which I say is just a case of value judgments. The frequency and occurrence. The symptoms meeting criterion A must be present in the past month and occur at an average frequency at once a week. Well, all teenagers show one crazy idea and one weird experience and one bit of disorganised speech a week, and I don't think you can treat them against their will just because that. Now, I think that the problem here is that the people who devised this criterion have very little clinical experience. For 5 days a week, month after month, year in, year out, I'd see a dozen people a day who would satisfy this requirement. And the thing is, they get better without drugs, just because I talk to them, I watch them, and I reassure them, and gradually, either they get better or their condition defines itself. And the vast majority of them are not psychotic. They don't go on to show psychotic disorders. They get better without drugs. Now, is that a bit cheeky of me? I mean, I'm one of the world's most isolated psychiatrists. Is that cheeky of me to suggest that some of these terribly important people on the DSM-5 committee have very little clinical experience? No, it's not cheeky in the slightest, because they don't have clinical experience. The reason they're research is because they don't actually like clinical experience. They don't want to have to deal with difficult people at night. They don't want to have to sit down and talk to some, frightened and very agitated 6'4" teenager who's been dragged in by the police. They don't want to have to sit down and talk to him because they don't like it. That's not what they do, and their judgment is suspect. Now, the symptoms next one is that symptoms meeting criterion A must have begun or significantly worsened in the past year. This is ridiculous. If you wait long enough, everything you don't like about your relatives gets worse. It doesn't offer any means of distinguishing between the alleged patient's alleged condition actually getting worse and my tolerance getting thinner. Once again, it licenses the powerful to menace the disempowered. And what about people, this thing about treatment seeking? Symptoms are sufficiently distressing and or disabling to the patient or others. So what this means again is that people can just drag somebody in and say, oh, he's getting worse, we want him on drugs. And there's enough of this going on in the schools as it is without licensing more people to do it. And I think there is a reason, there's a basis here somewhere for some intervention. For example, if you've got a man who believes he's Jesus Christ and he's just about to set off to walk across Niagara Falls to prove it, okay, maybe you've got a case. But dealing with upset teenagers, no, you can't say to them, have you had your tablets today, dear? Well, I mean, they do that in some places, but not in ours, and we get by. Now, the last two, the characteristic attenuated psychotic symptoms, this is just going to license people again to say to somebody, oh, you've got characteristic attenuated psychotic symptoms. But of course, what's a psychotic symptom to one person is just normal variation to another. Particularly if you look at people in religions, in political groups, or what seems crazy to one person, of course, makes perfect sense to the next, even in matters of politics. What seems completely crazy to one generation is hot fashion to the next generation. So I think this is just, again, very, very bad. And the criteria for DSM-5 psychotic disorder have never been met. Well, that's in the definition, of course, so we don't have to worry about that one. So I think that the problem there is that, just to go back a bit, is that PRS is not science. And the next point, of course, is that there's not enough psychiatrists to administer the newly widened diagnoses, so non-psychiatrists will demand the right to make the diagnosis and then to initiate treatment, and that'll mean that you've got a whole lot of people running around who are not subject to discipline. And this argument's irresistible because it's actually written into the criteria. That is to say, people must be recognised as mentally ill and given early treatment because there's not enough psychiatrists. The other thing is, so that means that standards of clinical practice will inevitably drop and psychiatry will slip further into irrelevance. And next one is that a psychiatrist who doesn't diagnose psychotic risk syndrome will be culpable. So if you have somebody like me who says, what about we just wait? You know, we'll just sit and watch him, we'll just see what happens over the next few months. If that person disappears and doesn't come back and later something goes wrong, well then I'll be sued, even 20 years down the track. So that there'll be this enormous pressure on psychiatrists to make the diagnosis, to make a false positive diagnosis, rather than run the risk of exposing themselves to a risk of being sued years later. And point 5, the diagnosis of psychotic risk syndrome will carry huge and unpredictable social consequences. Even today, people want to join the army if they've been given stimulant drugs at school years and years before, then they are at risk. I mean, they can't just walk in and say, I'm eligible, I'd like to come in. They have to be reviewed and they can be rejected on that basis. So I think that the psychotic risk syndrome is a case of non-science running riot. It can't be operationalised. It can't be put into practice. It'll be hugely expensive. It trivialises mental disorder and it will take our society in unforeseen directions. And I think it's extremely bad. And it should be opposed stringently and vehemently by anybody who takes a humanist position. Now, if we had a formal model of mental disorder, of course, it would predict the pre-psychotic state. And if you look at the models in history, Copernicus came up with a correct model of the heliocentric model. Well, then that predicted where the new planets would be found. Pasteur was able to predict diseases just because he found bugs in people, and Koch did the same, Virchow, these great people. Mendel made predictions about genetics just as soon as he had the correct model in his mind. Mendeleev was able to predict undiscovered elements just from his table, and the Einstein and the Bohr model of the atom, etc. So a formal model of mental disorder will predict the pre-psychotic state. And the whole point here is that the DSM committee is, the DSM-5 project is consuming a huge amount of psychiatric resources. That was a terrible slip, wasn't it? Of psychiatric resources that should be put into developing a model of mental disorder. And there's historical reasons why this isn't happening. But in the absence of a formal model of mental disorder, statistics will never fill the gap of a proper conceptual model. So psychiatry is in a pre-scientific state, and all the statistics by the DSM-5 committee won't change that. So more and more DSM-5 committees will spend more and more time developing more and more syndromes, but in the absence of a formal model of mental disorder, more will mean worse. More syndromes will mean worse psychiatry, worse time for ordinary people. That quote comes, of course, from Kingsley Amis. And 3 million hours is more, and DSM-5 will be worse psychiatry. And I think it should be abandoned forthwith. My prediction is that the DSM-5 project will collapse into a squabbling mess of bickering academics within 5 years. It won't get any further than that, and psychiatry will suffer. Mentally ill people will suffer as a result. And finally, I've just put some of the papers there that this is coming from, and chapter 6 of my book, and there's some references there, and on the last page you've got some of my books, or all of my books in fact, where you can find these arguments developed at much greater length. Thank you very much. So that's my case against DSM-5. I think that it will collapse into a squabbling heap of bickering academics, and no good will come of it. I don't believe it will survive more than about 5 years, unlike the others which have mostly struggled along for about 18 years. Anyway, time will tell. That's my prediction, and it's on record.